One of Total War Warhammer's greatest joys, at least for a guy like me, is creating lore-accurate armies for my lords. Doesn't matter if it's hard to use or not optimal, I love making sure my lords are followed by accurate armies. No doom stacks for me. I wager that at least some people here have a similar playstyle, so I've compiled this little reference video for everyone who wants to play with a completely lore-accurate Strigoi vampire army. In it, I'll give unit recommendations, a bit of lore for why they're appropriate, and an overall review of the build at the very end. The results might surprise you a little bit. As you might expect, the backbone of a Strigoi-themed army is Crypt Ghouls. Lots and lots of Crypt Ghouls. There are a few reasons for this. First, Strigoi vampires see themselves in these cursed creatures, as both have degenerated into feral states. As all vampires are inherently vain and self-absorbed, the Strigoi prefer to have servants who are similarly miserable to themselves. Additionally, because both Crypt Ghouls and the Strigoi dwell on the outskirts of civilization to avoid unwanted attention, they have plenty of chances to interact. This shared misery breeds a certain degree of kinship between the two groups, and Strigoi treat Crypt Ghouls much better than other vampiric bloodlines. A few are even downright protective of their ghouls, viewing them as loyal subjects to be protected. Crypt Ghouls, in turn, are drawn to the dark magic within a Strigoi like moths to a flame. The ghouls hope that the powerful undead will protect them. This protection isn't freely given, however, and the Strigoi demands blood, service, and adoration in return. Most ghouls happily accept this bargain, and many form courts that ape the customs of fallen Strigos. It is from this tradition that Strigoi vampires gained the title of Ghoul Kings by the peasants of Sylvania. Of course, Crypt Ghouls aren't the only troops a Strigoi leads into battle. While dedicated to their master, the cannibals aren't terribly effective when confronted with stat resistance. If the ghoul requires a bit of extra muscle, they'll create a few Crypt Horrors. These abominations, created by giving a Crypt Ghoul a bastardized version of the Blood Kiss, are much larger, stronger, and more dangerous than the average ghoul. The dark magic coursing through their veins lets them heal from mortal blows, and they're easily strong enough to bust down palisade walls. Crypt Horrors act as the shock troops of the Strigoi army, handling foes too dangerous for a ghoul. Despite these advantages, giving the Sacred Blood Kiss to a mere Crypt Ghoul is a step too far for most Strigoi vampires. They'd rather grant it to a more deserving individual. As such, Crypt Horrors are relatively rare, even in the service of a Ghoul King. Still, desperate times can call for desperate measures, and a Strigoi going to war will create a whole host of Crypt Horrors. Some mad individuals have abandoned their reluctance entirely and will create Crypt Horrors as a matter of routine. Armies led by such Ghoul Kings are particularly dangerous. Ghouls and Horrors aren't the only living creatures serving Strigoi Ghoul Kings. Necromancers, often of Strigoni descent, can be found serving the vampires. They loyally serve their generational overlords, raising the dead to bolster Strigoi's army. They also compensate for the Ghoul King's limited magical talent, providing magical support and firepower while the Strigoi focuses on ripping enemies apart with their talons. Strigoi that have access to the raw materials will occasionally make use of Graveguard in their armies. This is fairly rare, as Strigoi are poor spellcasters and can't raise legions of the heavily armored wights like other bloodlines can. Still, for the competent Ghoul King, they can act as sturdy anchor pieces for their army, letting the enemy crash upon them while the ghoulish hordes move in for the kill from the flanks. Strigoi that have survived since the fall of Strigos are particularly fond of Graveguard. The White's formality reminds the Ghoul Kings of when they were rulers, rather than exiles, and these ancient survivors appreciate that immensely. In addition to ghouls and Graveguard, Strigoi will seek out equally degenerate undead to act as warriors in their armies. Banshees are favored minions, as their misery somehow exceeds a Ghoul King's. Vargulfs, vampires that have completely abandoned the pretense of civilization, can also be found loping alongside packs of ghouls. The fact that ghouls often adopt these monsters as leaders, even without a Strigoi's influence, ensures that they'll loyally follow the Ghoul King. It would be bad enough to fail a Strigoi or a Vargulf on their own. To fail in front of both? Unthinkable. A Vargulf's presence is also sure to draw dire wolves, giving a Strigoi army some much-needed mobility. The undead canines will religiously follow their pack leader into battle, harrying the exposed underbelly of an enemy army. Finally, Strigoi are exceptionally good at animating the massive bats of Sylvania, turning them into terrorgeists. The process comes easily to the Ghoul Kings, as both creatures are feral, solitary beasts. Just like Crypt Horrors, Terrorgeists are led to drink some of the Strigoi's blood, cementing the bond between vampire and monster. Some Ghoul Kings choose to ride upon their Terrorgeists, while others will let them act independently in battle. Either way, the results are terrifying for the Strigoi's foes. There are few men alive who can survive a charging Terrorgeist, especially if it has a howling Ghoul King crouching upon its back. Now, with all that in mind, we can begin composing an army list for Total War Warhammer. Note that I'm designing this with single player, or campaign, in mind, as I think that's where themed armies can shine. The unique skill trees available to certain characters really enhances the theming experience. To begin, you have two possible Lord choices. The first option is the Strigoi Ghoul King Lord, which is available from turn 1 so long as you own the Grim in the Grave DLC from Total War Warhammer 1. The other option is the Strigoi Bloodline Lord, which was introduced for free alongside the Vampire Coast update. These aren't available from turn 1, and you'll need to unlock them with Blood Kisses. That also means you'll only be able to field 3 of them, as the Blood Kiss mechanic can only be used 3 times for any one bloodline. Despite the relative difficulty in unlocking them, I still heartily recommend the Bloodline Lord. In addition to having slightly more hit points and leadership than their counterpart, they actually have some unique skills designed to enhance some of the Strigoi-themed units. The Grave Eater skill, unlocked at rank 6, gives a 25% upkeep reduction for Crypt Ghouls in the army, and gives them +1 recruit rank as well. Monstrosities of More, unlocked at rank 10, decreases Crypt Horror upkeep in the army by 25% as well, and reduces their recruitment time by 1 round. Finally, the Grotesque Court, also unlocked at level 10, gives 6 leadership and 10% physical resistance to all Crypt Horrors and Ghouls in the army. This means a properly themed army is both cheaper and more powerful than it otherwise would be, something the Strigoi Ghoul King Lord can't do. After selecting your Lord, the rest of the army falls into place relatively quickly, no matter which one you chose. You'll want a dedicated spellcaster, as neither of your Lord options are great at it, so bring 1 Necromancer. Bring a Banshee to help the Strigoi bully characters and monsters, as well as provide some decent terror in infantry blobs. That should cover your hero requirements. Next, bring 6 Crypt Ghouls. They aren't optimal by any means, but if you're trying to make a themed army, then I think you should commit to the bit. While committing to said bit, take 4 Crypt Horrors with you as well. Not only are they flavorful, but they're also super useful. Their high weapon strength and mass makes them useful against heavy infantry and cavalry, and they can punch way above their price point if supported by infantry. Speaking of which, bring 3 units of Graveguard. These heavily armored warriors can act as an anchor piece for your army, just like in the lore, giving your horrors a buffer to fight inside. They'll also draw the enemy's attention, letting your hitting ghouls get into position. Finally, you'll want a strong monster contingent, as they'll be doing most of the work alongside your characters. 2 Vargulfs and 2 Terrorgeists can deal with most monsters, and can also distract the AI with well-timed attacks on the flanks. The Terrorgeists also give you a much-needed response to aerial opponents, something which you're otherwise completely unable to handle. With these monsters added, you've finally created a full 20 stack. Obviously, this can take a bit of time, but if you get some good raised dead piles, you can start rolling around the entire army by turn 30 or 40 without a problem. Maybe even turn 20 if your economy is pretty good. If you're curious about the exact practical applications of some of the units I've listed, as well as their lore, I recommend you check out their videos in the Monsters of Warhammer series on my channel. Crypt Ghouls and Crypt Horrors have already been released as of this video's making, and hopefully Terrorgeist will be hitting the channel soon as well. In those videos, I go into much greater detail about both their lore and gameplay mechanics. As a result, I've kept the information here relatively basic. Seriously, go check them out. I'll link them down below. Now, you may be wondering how this army fares in actual combat. Crypt Ghouls in particular are a tough sell, as they're really bad against armor, which you'll see throughout the game, especially later on. After playing with 2 such armies in my recent Manfred campaign though, I can say they're pretty good, and that's on the very hard difficulty settings too. The Crypt Horrors are remarkably resilient, and they can tear through huge blocks of mid-tier infantry when supported by Graveguard without any real threat. The Ghouls are good at running down enemy backlines and creating devastating flanks, which is always nice. In a pinch, they can also be a pretty good frontline, as they're really hard to kill once you've reached cannibalistic rituals, a tech that lets them self-heal in combat. I've seen 3 units kill a Blessed Carnosaur without losing a single model. The Terrorgeists and Vargulfs can handle isolated units or monsters, as well as potentially delivering terror right into an enemy flank or rear. That Terrorgeist Shriek can also do alright against blobs of infantry, though I will say it's lackluster otherwise. A Necromancer using the lore of vampires keeps your units in excellent condition, and the Banshee is another good piece of terror and leadership that never moves too far away from the front lines. The Ghoul King, of course, is good at killing other lords, heroes, and monsters as well. All in all, this army has worked great in practice. I've defeated fully kitted out Khornate armies led by Scarbrand, Lizardman armies with a bunch of Coatls in them, and more Tomb King Chaff armies than I care to count. I haven't faced every faction with them, of course, as I'm only 100 turns in the campaign, but I have a lot of hope for it going forward. If the concept of running a Strigoi themed army appeals to you, know that it's not a waste of time like I thought it would be. Once you pick up some techs and skill points, it can be a downright menace. Of course, some matchups are easier than others. Heavy armor still needs to be handled carefully, and I haven't tried this against a ranged heavy faction yet. Preliminary tests against high elves haven't been bad so far, but I'll need to take more fights to make sure. If you do find yourself getting overwhelmed by archers, you could try swapping out your Graveguard for dire wolves, but these wolves aren't as reliable as undead infantry. All I'll say is that it's untested so far. My final score for this army is a solid 6.5 out of 10. It's definitely better than average, and it's worked better in practice than I would have imagined while theory crafting. I really didn't see it working against Scarbrand, for instance. You could probably throw this against most armies and call it a day. Still, I can't give it much higher than 6.5. If I had tested against Dwarfs, Vampire Coast, and the Empire before making this video, I could probably give a more accurate rating, but some of its theoretical matchups are too bad to give a higher rating. Also, unless your Necromancer has Wind of Death fully upgraded and a lot of available magic, you're going to get swamped in some 2v1 battles. Finally, unless the AI is stupid and dives in headfirst, you might suffer when fighting against cavalry or monster-heavy opponents. Mobile armies, especially with lots of anti-large, are bad news. Long story short, despite being very strong, it has some clear-cut weaknesses that really can't be ignored. But maybe you can't ignore them more than you'd think when looking at the stats. With that last bit of advice, we've come to the end of our overview of a lore-accurate Strigoi army. I hope this was interesting for you guys, as I feel like there's a dearth of easily accessible resources when you want to build a flavorful army for any given lord. That was actually how I got into Warhammer lore in the first place. I wanted to accurately theme an army for each province of the Empire. Sadly, the internet didn't really have any good advice, so now I'm stepping in to fill that role. I'm hoping to make this a new series on my channel. The vampiric bloodlines are pretty easy to do this with, but I'm hoping to eventually do something similar with Empire provinces, Bretonnian dukedoms, dwarf holds, elven kingdoms, everything. I'll also test how feasible they are in Total War, because I definitely wouldn't have recommended the Strigoi build before I actually played with it. If that interests you, you can leave a like or a comment as an indicator that I should keep doing this. Basically everyone who watches these videos is already subscribed, but if you aren't, consider doing so. I do take notice of these metrics, and while I'm a fickle critter that does what he wants, I do tend to bend towards content that both interests me and does well. I'm hoping this little series can do both. That's all I have for today though, so until next time, this has been Sigmar's Chosen, signing off for now.